Sean McDowell is a gifted communicator with a passion for equipping the church to make the case for the Christian faith. He speaks at churches, universities, and conferences around the world and is currently an assistant professor in the Christian Apologetics program at Biola University. After graduating summa cum laude from Talbot School of Theology with a double master's degree in theology and philosophy, Sean earned a PhD in apologetics and worldview studies from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in 2014. It's time to live with the boldness of the apostles. Please welcome Sean McDowell.
Thank you. In 2010, I was with my friends and apologists Brett Kunkel and Jay Warner at Berkeley with about 30 high school students. We went out on campus, got into conversations with some students who were there about their faith or lack thereof. We invited in some agnostics and skeptics and people of other religions to speak to our students, teaching our students how to defend their faith in loving conversation. Well, we brought in a friend of mine who's an atheist. He's actually a mythicist, doesn't even believe Jesus existed. And he's trying to talk my students into believing this. They're gently pushing back. And finally, one of my students raised his hand. He goes, "Sir, how on earth would all the apostles die as martyrs if Jesus didn't even exist?" The skeptic looked back at him and he says, "Can you give me any evidence that any of them actually died as martyrs?" And simultaneously, they all turned and looked at me. I'm like, look at Jay Warner, he's the detective. And I sat there and I thought, you know what? I actually don't know the answer to that. Do you? You've probably heard it your whole life. The apostles died as martyrs. And I sat there, I thought, number one, I need to know the answer. Number two, I need a PhD dissertation topic. The timing was fortuitous. And I began to look into this and realize that nobody had examined it and actually studied this question. So maybe you've heard somebody say something like this: even though they were crucified, stoned, stabbed, dragged to death, skinned, and burned, every last apostle Jesus, except maybe John, proclaimed his resurrection until his dying breath, refusing to recant under pressure to the authorities. Therefore, their testimony is trustworthy and the resurrection is true. How many of you heard some version of this argument? Right, good. The obvious question is this actually true? Is that a good argument? Should we use this argument anymore? Well, let me do a quick test of your knowledge of church tradition to see what stories you've heard about the fates of the apostles. So, according to tradition, which apostle was crucified upside down in Rome? Peter. Okay, most people are familiar with this story. How about killed with spears in India? Okay, good response, a little less. That's right, the story with Thomas. How about skinned alive? I heard one or two people say it. Bartholomew. How about stoned to death in Jerusalem? By the way, this has nothing to do with smoking pot. You have to clarify this now that we live in California. Nothing to do with smoking weed. Killed by stones in Jerusalem. Okay, Stephen, not one of the 12. That's true. That's in Acts. Actually, James, of course, the question is which James? There's two different James by which there is this tradition, interestingly enough. How about crucified on an X-shaped cross? Andrew, in Greece. How about beheaded in Rome? Okay, a few of you got that. Paul. How about died a natural death in Ephesus? You know what surprised me in my research? There are some leading conservative scholars who think John died as a martyr. I don't buy it, but interesting evidence they put forth. John. How about crucified in Hierapolis? Philip. Now there's more traditions than this. But as he pushed back on me that night, the skeptic did, I started to wonder, are those traditions true? How do we know this, historically speaking? Well, I spent 3 years writing my dissertation and an academic book out of this, actually 3 years plus. And here's, I think, the simplest way we can formulate this argument. Are you ready? Here's what I think the best way is. The willingness of the apostles to face persecution and martyrdom indicates their sincere conviction that Jesus appeared to them after his death. I think this is the heart of where we want to focus and what we can know historically speaking. Their willingness to suffer and die doesn't necessarily show that it's true, but it shows they really believed it. So let's take a look at the evidence that the apostles actually died as martyrs. Now, there's kind of 3 steps that we need to establish for this argument to work. All right, and the first step is simply that the disciples had a resurrection faith. Some people argue that the resurrection emerged decades or centuries later, and it wasn't a part of the first Christian belief. If so, even if they died as martyrs, it would do nothing to help establish the resurrection. So did they have a resurrection faith? Second, were early Christians actually even persecuted? Did Christians have a message that put them in the crosshairs of the religious leaders and the Roman authorities? And third, what is the actual evidence that we have? The apostles died as martyrs. Let's take a look at our first question, that the disciples had a resurrection faith. Now, there's a number of pieces of evidence we can look at, but as I'm asking this question, what I want to know is what's the earliest first record we have of what the apostles believed? So, purely on a historical level, what's the first and most ancient document that captures what Christians believe? And I think the way to do this is to look at what's called early Christian creeds. Now we know that the letters of Paul and the Gospels written sometime between the late 40s and arguably into the 90s. But what's interesting about this is over the past few decades, scholars have found something called creeds that are embedded within the letters of Paul and the writings of Peter. Now we know this because of the language that is used or the style of the writing. There's a certain pattern that tells us Peter and Paul, etc., are embedding in their writings a certain saying that predates the document itself. Now, there's dozens of these creeds we could look at, but perhaps the earliest one, and the most important one, many of you know this, is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, very briefly notice, Paul writes 1 Corinthians to the church in Corinth. And almost all scholars accept that Paul wrote this probably in the mid-50s. Notice how Paul starts. He says, "For I delivered to you," and by the way, who is you? The church in Corinth. Good. "As of first importance, what I also received." I remember when my oldest son, who's 14, was a kid, he goes, "Dad, what's the most important thing you know?" It's an interesting question. Paul is passing on of first importance. Now notice what he says, "I delivered to you, the Corinthians, what I also received." You see what he's saying? I'm passing on a tradition to you in this letter that I received earlier than the writing of this letter. Now we know Paul visited the apostles roughly 3 to 5 years after his conversion and then 14 years later. I think a good case can be made that he received this tradition within 3 to 5 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And what does he say? That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried, raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Jesus lived, died, buried, appeared. The first historical record we have is about the resurrection. Second, look at the apostolic preaching. Now, of course, we're going to find this in the book of Acts. Have you ever noticed how much of the book of Acts are just these speeches of the apostles? Have you looked closely at what constitutes those speeches? You know what it is? At the heart of it is the death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, the first speech that Peter gives, he says this Jesus, delivered up according to definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pain of death because it was not possible for him to be held by it. The first speech we have at Pentecost is centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this is why modern scholars today almost unanimously agree that the apostles had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. The first message the apostles preached was that Jesus had risen from the grave. James Dunn writes this. He said, "It is an undoubted fact." And by the way, anytime you see a scholar use words like undoubted fact, you should pause. Because I'm an apologist, so I like to make the strongest case that I can, but there's also this like scholar's creed that says don't overstate anything. In fact, understate it. This is what scholars are supposed to do. So James Dunn is like, it's an undoubted fact that the conviction that God had raised Jesus from the dead and had exalted Jesus to his right hand transformed Jesus' first disciples and their beliefs about Jesus. So what we know from the earliest records is that the disciples said they had seen the risen Jesus, and this constituted the message that they preached. But recently there's been some pushback saying that actually early Christians weren't even persecuted. There's a book in 2013 by a scholar by the name of Candida Moss called The Myth of Persecution. Christians invented this idea of persecution, but it didn't really happen. So I don't know, what's the evidence Christians were actually persecuted? Well, let's take a look at the Christian story. You realize John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christianity, died as a martyr. Jesus, the founder of Christianity, died as a martyr. And Stephen in the book of Acts, one of the first apostles or followers, died as a martyr. From before its time, Christianity is a martyrdom movement. That's what it is. But also, Jesus taught that his followers would suffer. It's all over the Gospels. This passage is particularly seen. I do see some of you taking vociferous notes. I'm going to give you a link to this presentation, a couple other articles that might help at the end, okay? So if that's helpful, I'm going to give you a link to that. But look what Jesus taught. He says, "Behold, I am sending you," and this is the disciples, "out as sheaves in the midst of wolves. Be wise as serpent and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you'll drag before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." Now notice something. He's sending them out among the religious people in the area of Judea. But what does Jesus mention? Governors and kings, because he's prepping them for in the future when they go out and proclaim this message, which will run directly in contrast with the message of the broader Greco-Roman culture. Third, suffering for Jesus is a central theme in the New Testament. I would encourage you when you're done with this conference, here's some homework. Go read the entire New Testament and circle or underline or keep note of every time it says you should expect to have trials and sufferings because of following Jesus. I took these notes and was shocked, number one, that I had never seen it before, but how the idea that we suffer as a result of following Jesus is a consistent, significant theme through the entire New Testament. Paul says, expect to suffer. In Philippians, written probably from jail, Hebrews talks about believers being sawed in half, being beaten, thrown in prison, killed with swords. James says, rejoice in your suffering. Peter says, expect to suffer for God's will. And Revelation talks about those who died as martyrs crying out because of their bloodshed. Friends, it's all over the Christian scriptures. But it's not just in the Christian scriptures. We see it outside, first appearing in the writings of Tacitus, early 2nd century. Now, Tacitus writes this. He starts off and he says, therefore, to eliminate this rumor. Now, Tacitus was a Roman writer, and the rumor was that Nero had set fire to Rome. He says, to eliminate this rumor, he, Nero, falsely produced defendants and inflicted the most extraordinary punishments upon those who hated for their crimes. By the way, if Christians were inventing this, would they describe themselves as being hated for their crimes? Of course not. The origin of this name was Christ, whom Procurator Pontius Pilate put to death in the reign of Tiberius. Crushed for a while the deadly superstition. Would they describe their movement as a deadly superstition? Of course not. Burst forth again only throughout Judea, the source of this evil. But even throughout Rome, to which all horrible and shameful things flow from everywhere and are celebrated. Therefore, the first persons arrested were those who confessed. Now, I'm going to stop right there. What does it say? People were arrested who what? Confessed. So their suffering was due to their proclamation of following and claiming Christ. And he describes how they were treated in circus games and burned to death, etc. Now, you know why the early Christians were persecuted to a degree here? Rome didn't care if you worshiped Jesus as God. But if you didn't worship the other gods, you were the reason there was famine and they lost war and there were floods. Christians were believing something that put them at odds with the wider culture. Now, we don't have record of all the different provinces persecuting Christians, but this is in Rome in the 60s. Precedent is set that Christians could be persecuted for proclaiming the name of Jesus. Friends, the early Christians proclaimed the resurrection. Second, this message put them in direct conflict with the Roman Empire. Third, what's the evidence they actually died as martyrs? And we don't have time to look at all 12, plus James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. We're going to just briefly touch on 4, and I'll tell you how you can track this down and study this to your heart's content if you want to know. But I'm going to show my cards for a minute. In all my research on this, hundreds of hours, I think of the 12 apostles, James and Paul, we have good historical confidence 4 of them died as martyrs. And 2 are at least minimally more probable than not. So take Peter, for example. Let's start with Peter. First evidence we have is in John chapter 21 in Scripture. It says, "Truly, truly, I say to you," this is Jesus speaking to Peter. "When you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." There's debate whether this is crucifixion or not, but the writer of John makes it clear. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this to him, he said, "Follow me." Now, what is Jesus doing? Remember, Peter had denied Jesus. "I'll go and die for you." And he goes, "You're actually going to betray me." What's he doing now? He's saying, "Yes, now you will die for me. Just as I was the good shepherd and led the flock to my death, you are the new shepherd who will lead the apostles, and you will go to your death." Even Bart Ehrman says, "It is clear that Peter's being told he will be executed, won't die of natural causes, and this will be the death of a martyr." Second source from the first century, by the way, is a writing called First Clement. This is a writing written from Rome by Clement, or at least Clement and a group, to the church in Corinth. And in the context, you have to read the context to appreciate this. It's about how division ultimately leads to death. Jealousy leads to division, division leads to death. So he writes, he said, "But to stop giving ancient examples, let us come to those who became athletic contenders in quite recent times. We should consider the noble examples of our own generation. Because of jealousy and envy, the greatest and most upright pillars were persecuted, and they struggled in the contest even to death. We should set before our eyes the good apostles." Now, he doesn't tell us who those apostles are, but he says there's Peter, who because of unjust jealousy bore up under hardship not just once or twice, but many times, having thus borne his witness. He went to the place of glory that he deserved, which means he went to the point of death because of his sufferings. We have 2 first century references to the martyrdom of Peter. Now, if you actually go further, you know what you'll find? You'll find 10 sources of varying strength and historical value that consistently and unanimously tell us that Peter died as a martyr. We have very good historical probability reason to believe that Peter died as a martyr. 10 sources before the end of the 2nd century, and what you might call the living memory that Peter died as a martyr. What about Paul? Now in Paul, you also have the writing of 1st Clement. Notice what it says. It says, because of jealousy and strife, Paul pointed the way to the prize for endurance. 7 times he bore chains. He was in exile and stoned. He served as a herald in both the East and the West. And he received the noble reputation for his faith. He taught righteousness to the whole world. You see a little exaggeration, obviously, going on. And he came to the limits of the West, bearing his witness before the rulers. And so he was set free from this world and transported to the holy place, notice, having become the greatest example of endurance. Now, obviously, Jesus is the greatest example. So what he really means is, outside of Jesus, Paul, this minister of suffering, even amidst the division around him, kept proclaiming the message and persecuted and suffered to the point of death. We have one 1st century reference to Paul. Now, if you go into the 2nd century, you know what you find? You find 7 more sources, which means we have 8 of varying strength, tying to the martyrdom of Paul. Like Peter, we have very strong reason to believe Paul died as a martyr. It's the consistent, unanimous testimony of history that Paul died as a martyr. Now, third, let's look at James, the brother of Jesus. Now, James was not one of the 12, but he's referred to as an apostle, leads the early church. We see in the book of Acts and in 1 Corinthians. In fact, what's interesting about James is we're told in Mark 3 and John chapter 7 that Jesus' family thinks he's kind of crazy, he's out of his mind. But then James has an appearance of the risen Jesus recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and Acts tells us he becomes leader of the early church. So what's the evidence that the brother of Jesus died as a martyr? Now, one of the sources for James is very, very interesting, because what you notice right here is a source from Josephus, a Jewish writer at the end of the 1st century. So now we not only have a 1st century source, we have a hostile source, or at least a source not sympathetic to the Christian view. Now notice what it says. It says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he, Ananus, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, who was James. And some others or some of his companions, when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Now, there's a couple things that's interesting about this. People in that day were not ordinarily referred to as the brother of somebody else. They were referred to as what? The son, right? Johnson, Donaldson, Clementson, the son of Don, the son of John. But he's referred to as the brother of Jesus. Why? Well, if your brother is more significant, namely God, of course they didn't believe that, but if your brother is more well-known and more significant, you'd be referred to in that fashion, the brother of Jesus. And interestingly enough, James was not referred to this a lot in other passages, which means it seems to be unique to Josephus, the way he's titled here, who was called the Christ, whose name was James. Now, by the way, there's another passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, you're probably familiar with in Josephus, that scholars debate back and forth. But almost all scholars accept this as veridical. Do you know why? Because why on earth would any Christian writer make this up? All we're told is Jesus in passing as the brother of James. It would do no good for an early Christian to go, oh, look at this source in Josephus. It says Jesus existed. Even Bart Ehrman says nobody doubted that Jesus existed until the 18th century. That's why the vast majority of scholars accept this as being legitimate. Delivered him to be stoned. Now, we'd have to ask in the Jewish law at that time, what would this mean? I think the best explanation is stoning was valid according to the law if you led a city astray, which is what James was arguably doing by publicly proclaiming and leading a church based on the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, the fourth one I think we have good source for. And by the way, with James, if you count that source, we have 6 sources from the 1st and 2nd century that agree on the death of James. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting about James, though, is these 2 sources are Christian sources. These 2 are Gnostic, and Josephus is Jewish. So we have Gnostic, Christian, and Jewish sources that agree on the death of James. That's pretty solid historical evidence from within the first 2 centuries. Now, the last one that I think we can strongly affirm is James, the son of Zebedee. This is only the second one that's mentioned in Scripture. Peter's mentioned again in John 21, and James, the son of Zebedee, is mentioned in Acts 12, 1 and 2. Now, of course, the reliability of this passage depends upon the historicity of the book of Acts, and that would lead us far astray. But good reason to laugh. We are not going there, don't worry. We have very good reason through ancient texts, through archaeology, through the internal witness to believe that Acts is a reliable historical document. But notice what it says. This is about that time Herod king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now, in his 3-volume massive set on Acts, Craig Keener says, this reads just like a standard execution account in the ancient Near East. Now, later in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, you see this legend and flowery material start to appear. But this is unanimously agreed on by the church. It's early. It's in a book that's historical. I think we have good reason to believe that this reports what happened to James. So we have 4 we have good reason to believe are true. Now, what about the rest of the apostles? You're probably thinking, wait a minute, what about these other stories we heard about? Philip, was he crucified in Greece? What about Bartholomew? What about Matthias? You haven't even mentioned Matthias. Well, here's a few things that we know. One is a probable case can be made for Thomas and Andrew. Now, why do I say probable? Because now we're dealing in the mid to late 2nd century and early 3rd are the earliest sources we have. Do you see how it's more historically removed? And there's less sources for them, and they both have some legend in those materials. So I think a decent case can be made for Thomas and Andrew, but if we're looking at it historically speaking, we have to admit that it's not as strong as the 4 we looked at. That's for sure. So maybe 6 at best we could make a case for out of 14. There's not a record any of the apostles recanted their faith. This is actually more significant than I think you realize. Nobody recorded anything that I could find that a single apostle abandoned their faith at any point before their death. One of my friends who's a critic, he goes, that's an argument from silence. I said, yes, but it's an argument from silence with some teeth. And here's what I mean by this. Think about it. In the 2nd and 3rd century, these skeptics start writing against the Christian faith. They would have reason to cite any known tradition of what happened to the apostles to discount the faith. Second, into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you have debates among Christians. What happens to a Christian who fails to proclaim and confess Christ when they're being tortured for their faith? Can they be allowed back in the church? Now, if there was even a story that this happened to Matthew or Matthias or James, surely some Christian would have said, wait a minute, you're saying I can't be let in? What about Matthias? So I think both friends and foes would have reason if there was any tradition about this to cite it. So I think the silence here has some significance. But third, to be honest, the historical evidence is late, legend-filled, and contradictory for the rest of the apostles. That might disappoint you, but that's the truth. That's the truth. Bartholomew skinned alive, the earliest record I could find is 500 AD. It doesn't mean it's false, but what historical confidence can we have in this? What historical confidence can we really have in one source that late? Not to mention their sources that Bartholomew was crucified, burned to death, killed with swords, skinned alive, and put in a bag and thrown in the water. Either he had one really bad day or something's going on with the sources here. Now, instantly, I know what people are thinking. What about other martyrs? You're saying the apostles' willingness to suffer and die is significant. But haven't a lot of people been willing to suffer and die for their belief? And of course, we think of 9/11. By the way, I will use this example, but I will not really refer to Muslim terrorists or any terrorists as martyrs. There's a difference between laying your life down for others and willingly taking other people's lives. But for the sake of illustration, because the jargon is used, I will use it for this example. People say, look, there were 19 terrorists. That's more than the 12 apostles. Does that mean it's true? Here's the difference people miss. Nobody doubts that those 19 terrorists thought that their understanding of Islam was correct. But they didn't witness anything firsthand. They received everything from others, at best secondhand, probably more fifth, sixth, seventh removed. But the apostles saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. You see the difference? Muslim terrorists died for what they received at best secondhand. The apostles were willing to die for what they claimed to have seen firsthand. If someone walks in here, morbid example, and shoots me, they go, do you believe in Jesus? I say yes, and they shoot me. At best, you could say, all right, that guy actually really believed it. Good for him. Maybe you wouldn't say good for me, but you get the point. My death would prove nothing about the truth of Christianity, because nothing about Christianity relies upon my testimony of it. Same with anybody else who dies for their religious movement. But the Christian movement was that Jesus had risen from the grave, and the tomb was empty, and appeared to his apostles. And they were willing to suffer and die for that proclamation. Here's what I think we know. The apostles were all willing to suffer and die because they believed Jesus had risen from the grave. There's no evidence any of them recanted. And we know, in fact, that at least some of them were martyred, signing their testimony in their own blood. What else could they have done to convince us of the sincerity of their testimony? Friends, the apostles were not liars. This wasn't a big conspiracy. Now, their willingness to suffer and die doesn't disprove the hallucination hypothesis, does it? No. You need something else to disprove that. This is one piece of a larger argument for the resurrection and for Christianity. But in our age of fake news, when people will hardly even walk across the street for what they believe, the apostles proclaimed that Jesus had been risen. They were beaten, they were threatened, they were thrown in prison, all willing to suffer and die. And we know with confidence that at least some of them did. I believe we can trust the sincerity of the apostles. How about you? Thank you for the chance to share. I had a chance to update evidence with my father, his classic book, and one of the new chapters is on the fate of the apostles. So there's a summary of this, if that helps. That's outside for you. And then this presentation, if it's helpful, SeanMcDowell.org. Don't forget AMP. And I put two other articles in there that people always ask me. Was Peter really crucified upside down? I put a response to that. And what about Joseph Smith? Did he die as a martyr? So I've attached those as PDFs because those are questions I get asked all the time in apologetics. So hope that'll be helpful to you.